Good afternoon and welcome to the Chadron State College TLPEC webinar over First Principles Thinking. I'm Tish Mindeman, the Instructional Design and Technology Specialist, and today's webinar is meant to be interactive. So I'll be asking questions and asking for input. Feel free to unmute as needed and provide feedback. I'll try and watch the chat for any questions, but if I don't see it right away, I will be answering questions at the end of the presentation also. I want to thank you for coming today. So the first question I have is, how many of you are familiar with first principles?
I am not. Me either.
Okay, well, that's fine because you're going to learn all about it today. So let's start with a few definitions. First principles thinking began with Aristotle. He really believed that knowledge is already in humans, just waiting to be unlocked. So that leads us to our first definition. What do you think the definition of belief is?
Maybe like a value?
Okay.
Or a closely held idea?
Okay. So the belief is defined in part by the Oxford English Dictionary as a condition that exists within a person's mind. So it's something that they believe and it exists within their mind, but it's not necessarily true. So what about knowledge? What do you think the definition of knowledge is?
An educated understanding of a topic.
Okay.
Or like a collection of information?
Okay. So knowledge is the belief in a proposition that a person is justified in holding as true. So there's something that backs up that particular belief. What about truth?
That is a tricky one.
It is a tricky one. So the definition from Oxford again is found in facts that exist independently of belief. So they're true whether or not someone believes them. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So I could think that the sky's not blue, but in all actuality, whether I believe it or not, the sky is blue. So that leaves us with skepticism and doubt, which exist between knowledge and belief. So they're kind of that in between of knowledge and belief. So the last definition we'll look at is first principles thinking, and it was first developed by Aristotle, but it was recently popularized by Elon Musk. At its core, first principles thinking is almost like chemistry, breaking the problem down into its most immutable form. So how do you think you do this? How do you think you take a first principles approach? Absolutely. Categorize. So the very first thing you do is you state the goal. So if we were talking science, we would state our hypothesis, but there's not always a hypothesis when we're solving a problem. So we're just going to state whatever our goal is. What are we trying to achieve? The second step is to identify any assumptions we have and sort out facts from opinions and belief. What can we prove and what is backed by usable data? Step 3 is to break it down into the factual components. So like Katie was talking about, Aristotle used hierarchical thinking. Let's say your goal is to write an essay. What are essays made up of? Paragraphs. Can we break it down any further than that?
Sentences, words.
Excellent. So we know that essays are made of paragraphs, paragraphs are made of sentences, sentences are made of words, and words are made out of letters. So that would be the most immutable step. In step 4, we would determine what is possible. So we would look at all 26 letters in the alphabet to find what words we can make that are relevant to that essay topic. And then finally, in step 5, we would use those words to make sentences that then form paragraphs that then form a well-written essay. Now, this is very simplified, but it is analogous to the idea of first principles thinking. Any questions so far?
No.
Okay. So speaking of analogies, have you ever wondered why they are so prevalent in our written and oral traditions?
To make things relatable.
It does make things relatable. Our brain loves to make connections. It loves to connect the new to the old. And it's why in education we scaffold. You tie the new knowledge to an old idea. But the problem with analogies is that they are full of emotion and not necessarily fact. One of the examples in this slideshow says that if A is like B and B is like C, then A must also be like C. So I like to use that a sandwich has bread and meat, and a hamburger is a sandwich. So therefore, a hot dog must also be a sandwich. Now, that's not necessarily true. Some people don't think hot dogs
That's controversial.
But this might be true, but we can't assume that because things are like that they are the same. And we all have pockets of incomplete knowledge, and we need to utilize first principles thinking to discover what these pockets are and fill in the gaps with our knowledge. Have any of you ever heard of the Dunning-Kruger Effect? So the Dunning-Kruger shows that more times than not, people overestimate their abilities and can't see the problems that creates due to a lack of knowledge because they don't have the knowledge to see the problem. So being an expert in one area doesn't mean that you're an expert in all areas. But by using first principles and seeking out new knowledge from many different sources, we can make sure that we aren't reasoning by analogy, but instead using facts and data to inform our decision making. So let's go back to our analogy from the previous slide. If A is like B and B is like C, then A must also be like C. Things that are similar must be related. So looking at these pictures, which of these animals do you think is most closely related based on that analogy? Now, if you're a science whiz, you know the answer, but imagine if you were basing it solely from analogy. Which do you think are most closely related? Yeah, so the iguana and the T-Rex, we would probably think were most closely related. But in all actuality, the dinosaur and the iguana are not the most closely related. If we look at facts, the kestrel and the dinosaur are more closely related based on genetics, evolutionary history, and taxonomical linkage. And that's the problem with analogous reasoning, is that it isn't always right because it's not built on facts and data. As humans, we like analogies and we like to be right. So what do? We use confirmation bias to help back our faulty reasoning. And we are all guilty of finding an echo chamber and staying there because it's comfortable. Contradictory evidence makes us very defensive. So instead of listening to differing opinions, we seek out those that support our ideas. Now, not a new phenomenon. Copernicus was called a heretic. He was exiled from the church and not recognized for his great achievements to science for many years after his death. The people at the time didn't want to believe that they weren't the center of the universe. They based their opinions on fear and analogy, even when Copernicus had facts and data to prove that his assertion was correct. Can you think of any other examples from history? So one that I can think of right off the top of my head might be Galileo. He was also treated the same way. Most scientists of the time were treated in that fashion because people were basing it on analogy and not fact. So the best way to identify if you're reasoning by analogy is to look for these red flags listed here. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list, but they are the most commonly used. We've always done it that way. That's how everyone does it. If then, so if eating chocolate and not exercising works for Susie, it should work for me too. We know that that's not how that works. And so these are those red flags for reasoning by analogy. Now, when we are looking to reason by first principles, we might consider raising doubts. Does anyone know why it would be important to raise doubts?
To further conversation.
Okay. Yeah. So there's two types of doubt, Cartesian and philosophical, and both are critical to first principles because we have to question what we believe to make sure that we're basing our assumptions on fact. We question things to break them down and find facts and truth, and this is used to eliminate reasoning by analogy. Now, how many of you guys have kids or nieces or nephews? Have you ever been subjected to the never-ending parade of whys and end up with the because I said so as the final word? Now, these children were probably reasoning from first principles, or maybe they were just trying to annoy you. But let's assume they're really searching for the truth. They ask why and why and why so that they could get to that final nugget of truth. Now, when we talk about strategies for using first principles thinking, the first thing we think of is the 5 whys. So let's look at an example that happens quite commonly in Oklahoma, where I was from. So you go to open up the refrigerator the morning after a big storm and it's warm inside. So you ask yourself, why is my refrigerator warm? Well, I can't hear the motor running, so that must be why. Now, if we stopped right there, would we be able to fix the problem? Probably not. So next we have to ask ourselves, why isn't the motor running? We look over at the microwave clock and we notice that it's dark, so the power must be out. Well, why is the power out? Because of the ice storm last night. Why did the ice storm damage the power line? Because it got too heavy from the ice that it was exposed to because the power company never buried the lines. Well, why didn't they bury the line? Because it's too expensive. So now we find that the root cause of our warm refrigerator is a cheap power company executive. We can now get on the phone and find out when they'll be fixing the lines and advocate for them to be buried. And this is just one way that we can try and utilize first principles thinking. Do we have any questions so far?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
So, when you're first principles thinking, when you get to the root cause, does this structure allow for more than one root cause?
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about that in the next one. Yes, excellent. So the second method is Socratic questioning. And Socrates, who was a teacher of Plato, who then taught Aristotle, we're building those links into first principles. He also believed that knowledge was inside each person just waiting to be unlocked. And he thought that through asking the right questions, we could discover that knowledge. But the questioning has to be more than surface level if we're to discover the truth of the subject. So we can't just ask yes or no questions. We have to ask those open-ended, deep questions. Now, we're all familiar with the old saying, if you give a man a fish, you're going to feed him for a day. But if you teach a man to fish, you're going to feed him for his entire life. So the same is true in our own endeavors with knowledge. If you give a student an answer, that does not ensure they'll be able to come up with the answer the next time. But if you continuously ask probing questions that lead them to the correct answer, that increases their retention and likelihood to come to the answer again. Likewise, in our first principle thinking, asking probing questions and exploring alternative viewpoints, not basing our assumptions on analogy, but on fact. So a cautionary statement about those two particular ways of first principles in teamwork is that it can feel contentious. Coming to the team with an open mind and a willingness to listen to differing opinions and keeping in mind the idea of the most charitable interpretation principle allows for the conversation to continue in a discussion format and not a debate. Because we don't want to win the conversation. We want to come up with the best solution. So we should always assume that the other person is operating with good intentions and be open to listening to them. Now, the last strategy that we're going to talk about is problem, cause, solution. And Katie, this is where we get into those, is there more than one root problem or more than one root cause? So a wise man who I work for once told me, don't come with problems, come with answers. So problems are often like symptoms and diseases. They're what you can see, but they're not the root cause. So if you have a fever, you can treat the fever, but does that mean that you've cured whatever's wrong with you? Not necessarily. If the fever is caused by a bacteria invading your body, that won't cure the disease. So the goal of this strategy is to identify what the causes of the problem are and find a solution to treat those root cause or causes. So if we go back to our disease analogy, it is important to treat the fever so that it doesn't become too high and damage the brain. This would be similar to focusing our efforts on the most urgent aspects of the problem. So putting out those fires very quickly, but then not stopping there. Once the fever's under control, we can find the ultimate cause or causes of the disease and direct our energy towards that solution. So if you have a large problem in your department or school or building, you obviously want to triage the most immediate problem first, but you shouldn't stop there. You should investigate to the root cause of the problem and then address that issue or issues. So this process is not easy or comfortable, but it is necessary because we as humans have deep emotions tied to our ideas of the hows and whys of what we do. We have to remember, though, to focus on what we can prove and what is factual. Anecdotal evidence is not usually relative to the subject, and it can subvert efforts and lead to reasoning by analogy. Any questions so far? Okay. So what is the main point of first principles thinking? Any ideas?
Maybe seeing things for what they are.
Okay. Yeah. Also, the point is to innovate and find creative solutions to problems. So many times we base our new solutions on something we've previously seen. So think about the evolution of the computer. Each iteration since 1942 is just an improvement on the original. But the original solution was a never before thought of idea. The first modern electrical or electronic digital computer was called the Attensoft-Berry computer, or the ABC. And it was built by a professor and his assistant. Does anybody know where? They were a professor and an assistant at Iowa State University, and this was in 1942. So his original problem was that there were many equations in physics that have numerous different variables and take a lot of time to solve by hand. And he wanted to speed this process up. So he came up with the ABC, which can actually calculate up to 29 variables at a time. And while it takes 15 seconds to do one process, that was considerably faster than doing it by hand. When we think of modern computers, they process thousands of things in a second. But this could do one thing in 15 seconds, but that was still considerably faster than trying to work it out by hand. So many times it's uncomfortable for us to think outside of our known solutions to divine something that no one's ever done before. But that's the main point of first principles is innovation, discovering those new and innovative ways to solve problems in our ever-changing landscape. So why is this specifically important to higher education? Well, if you look at this painting from the 14th century, it looks very similar to what our higher education classrooms look like today. We all know this classroom. There's the professor who's up front lecturing. There's that guy who went too hard last night, sleeping in the back of the class. There's the the guy macking on the girl while she's doing her best to pay attention. There's the best friends that are chatting through the whole class. And we're deeply committed to the way things have always been done in higher education. That's why our classes look very similar. But we can't innovate or serve our students to the best of our abilities if we continue to teach from this standpoint. Student bodies are much different from the 14th century. In fact, that's probably not a girl in that picture because we all know that girls weren't allowed to go to school in the 1500s. But we have to see that our student bodies are different, and the way that we've always done things does not work for our students anymore. So in order to serve our students to the best of our abilities, we should take a first principles approach. Why do you think it's important to incorporate first principles in our teaching?
I think it's a good avenue to get to like the root cause of some of the higher institution main issues and some of the issues that the students body face.
Right. Not only does it help our institutions be able to find solutions to problems that are facing our student bodies, but we want to teach our students fact. We don't want to teach them opinion or belief. We want to teach them fact. And this allows us to convey our content effectively, and it allows us to let go of ineffective strategies so we can make sure that we increase retention and persistence in our students, and we can make sure that we afford them access, diversity, equity, and inclusion in our classrooms. It's also important for us to utilize first principles thinking and research. So making sure that we're striving to discover facts and truth is essential to making discoveries to better our communities and then ultimately the world. Service is yet another area where we can employ first principles. Why do you think it's important for us to use first principles when serving others? So when we use these principles, we can make sure that we have an open mind to discover new solutions to common problems we see in every day in higher education. First principles in communication is important for similar reasons as service. Finding a way to communicate from a position of reason allows us to be more clear and effective, and also allows us to incorporate more diverse backgrounds and viewpoints. So all of this is to say that first principles is not easy. Questioning our underlying beliefs can be really uncomfortable, and it's difficult to push past our biases and assumptions to arrive at fact and reason. However, if we settle for reasoning by analogy, we remain in the way that it's always been, and we can't serve our students to the best of our ability. Innovation is only possible if we can find our way beyond the past by clarifying our thinking and then building new solutions that are unencumbered by assumptions or analogies. So does anyone have any final questions, comments? Oh, we got a question in the chat. Oh, that's a good question. How do we know what data to trust, and how do we sift that data out? So data is repeatable. The best way to understand that is that data is repeatable, and being able to understand if an experiment is repeatable and it's not influenced by bias. So you wouldn't necessarily trust a set of trials that were paid for by a company because they have a bias to make sure that the data comes out the way they want it to. So you have to have peer review, and you have to have repeatability.
For you, since first principles thinking in this presentation was geared towards higher education, do you think it can be applied to staff and faculty offices for students? And if you do think that, is there a different way to implement that depending on if you're in an office or academic setting?
Absolutely. So Katie asked that we were focusing on it in a higher education way. And is there a way to apply this to office situations or staff situations or even student situations? And the answer is yes. We currently have what we call the Library Network Governance Committee. And so when we are making decisions about what books to keep, what databases to maintain, any kind of budgetary issues, we always have to come with data that we can back up. And we always come with a business reason, and we break it down to the lowest level. So that allows us to make decisions that are not only right for our students and our institution, but also for our bottom line. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Okay, well, I hope that everybody had a good time and that you enjoyed the presentation. So this presentation will be available on our TLPEC website along with the PowerPoint and some lecture notes. So feel free to reach out to myself or Bruce to be able to let us know if we can provide any services for you. Thank you again.